Setz mich
an
erst.
Ecke gefühlt und weggegangen und das war nicht sofort, also das erst so, also zweitens Fieber, nicht schlechte Laune oder Chaos.
So darauf genächt auch so, oder geht?
Letzte Nacht ging. Das ist immer so ein Auf und Ab, einfach.
Ich glaube, einer davon ist meiner.
Genau gleich. Ich weiß nicht welcher, aber such dir einen aus.
Es sind ja noch Tausende da hinten.
Ja, stimmt.
Ja. Hey. Können wir doch alle relaten, oder?
Also nur.
Katja, will you let me know once it starts? Okay. Good evening, everyone. I would like to firstly welcome the audience, both those here in the room, but also those in the live stream, to this book launch event of Alexander Gallas' recent 2-volume publication, Exiting the Factory, Strikes and Class Formation Beyond the Industrial Sector. I'm Hanna Rössner, research assistant at the Working Group for Global Political Economy of Labor and Gender Relations at the University of Kassel, and I will be moderating today's book launch event. Just a quick note on what to expect today. After getting a short input or introduction to the book by the author Alexander Gallas, and there will be 3 comments on different chapters of the book to which the author gets the chance to respond. And afterwards, we'll open the room for questions and comments from the audience. So Dr. Alexander Gallas, the author of Exiting the Factory, is currently interim professor at the Working Group for Global Political Economy of Labor and Gender Relations at the University of Kassel. And his research interests include industrial action and strikes, global labor studies, and state and class theory. First of all, also congrats on this huge publication.
Thank you.
And then without further ado, please go ahead by briefly introducing your new publication.
Okay, I will stand up if that's okay. Yeah, thanks all for turning up. It's a big event for me, obviously, and I'm going to introduce you in the next 10 minutes or so to what the book is about. And then, yeah, Hanna has already explained it. We will have responses and also the opportunity for your questions and for a bit of debate around the book. Need to switch it on. Yeah. Here we go. First of all, I want to talk about global labor studies. And for me, this is a happy event, but also a sad event. On the right-hand side of this photo, you see Eddie Webster. And Eddie was an amazing colleague. And we actually had planned to do a book launch together in April. Because he also finished a book on informal work, even with the same publisher, and planned to visit Germany and visit Kassel. And it was very, very sad to hear that I think a couple of weeks before we had planned the event, he suddenly died. And well, of course, the event didn't go ahead. And so what I will do in this very first part, because Eddie was really an eminent global labor scholar and someone who really, really was important for the field, I will try to do in a way what we set out to do and talk a little bit about his contribution to what I did, or talk about the conversations we had around this. And this particular refers to the very first part of the first volume. And I want to start by introducing an idea that I discussed with Eddie, which is that I asked myself in the very first chapter of the first volume what it means to be on the side of workers. I do this by looking at key contributions to global labor studies, among them the book Grounding Globalization that Eddie wrote together with Rob Lambert and Andres Bezuidenhout. And in this literature, I also look at Beverly Silver's work, for example, and also at contributions that lay out the power resources approach. I find a normative theme, and I would say that in general, being on the side of workers means criticizing social domination and class domination in particular. I would say that that is sort of a theme running through this literature. A second point where Eddie's work was really important is in the chapter straight after that very first chapter. And in that chapter, I don't know, can we...
Yeah, I don't know what's happening. Do you have any control of the thing in your hand and you're pressing it involuntarily? Maybe?
No.
No?
Here we are. No.
Again.
Goes on and off. I mean, I can put it to the side or switch it off. That makes a difference. Okay. Let's try. Thank you. So, second chapter, I discuss a double challenge. What is this double challenge? Well, on the one hand, I detect what I would call the class analyst's dilemma, which means that we as academics are state-sanctioned experts. We are part of a state apparatus. And that state apparatus and the fact that we are state-sanctioned experts contributes to capitalist class domination in the sense that other people are shut out and are declared not to be experts. So this raises the question straight away, if you want to criticize class domination from an academic angle, how can you do it if you're complicit in this at the same time? The other challenge that is, I think, pretty clear is if you want to be on the side of workers, if you want to criticize capitalist class domination, how do you transfer the knowledge that you produce to the people that matter to you? And also, how do you ensure that their knowledge somehow travels to you? And in that context, I found an article in this book on my left, incredibly important, that Eddie wrote, which is a reflection on his experiences in apartheid South Africa. And he, in this chapter, describes what he calls being an organic academic, which means working in close conjunction under conditions of this very repressive regime, apartheid South Africa, with trade unions that challenge this regime. And how he tried to somehow develop questions and issues that relate to this work as trade unions. I myself take a different position in this chapter. I call myself an academic worker here, and I think people who have been in Kassel and have been around for a while have seen all the campaigns about and around academic work. And in that sense, I would say my own position is not so much based on this very clear-cut division of labor simply because I'm affected by precarity myself and immersed in the labor struggles in the university and the academic context. A third point of debate that mattered in the context of where I exchanged ideas with Eddie was the question of sources of workers' power, and he is known to be one of the persons who really shaped the power resources approach, which is very important for labor studies. And I, in this context, engaged with this approach, but also had one or two critical remarks about it. And in particular, I argued that it would be wrong to equate union capacities with class power. So that's sort of, if you will, the bone of contention in that debate, simply because unions are also co-opted into capitalist class domination, and obviously there are cases of union corruption, which means that you simply can't always equate their activities with the exercise of working class power. So these are three ideas that I developed in conversation with Eddie and that are reflected in the very first volume of the book, which is about class theory. So basically you can already see me briefly highlighting those ideas, that the issue of class and how to conceptualize class is crucial. And I think, and that was one of the motivations in the very first part, that global labor studies needs class theory, needs a thorough engagement with class theory. So in the very first part of the book, I try to lay out, first of all, what key contributions to global labor studies have to say on the issue of class, and then how I would conceptualize class. that brings me to a second strand. And the second strand of this book project is strike research. And I want to share here two book covers. Oh, one book cover and one newspaper cover, to be correct. And I just want to show that, unfortunately we can't see the covers right now. Screen keeps switching off. What you would see on the left-hand side would be a book by Richard Hyman called Strikes, which is one of the key books in the field of strike research.
Ismail, this is your moment.
Your moment.
Feel present. Every time somebody turns on the computer, you are in the room.
I am always so slow. Look.
I'm administering that account, so he's getting all the credit and I do the work.
Always works that way, right? Capitalism.
Email by Ismail was not signed by you.
Oh, really?
For a long
Well,
time.
we resemble each other pretty much.
Matja, is the stream working again?
Yeah. The cables are somewhat.
To make the conversation easier, I sometimes present myself as Wilma.
You're the spitting image, right?
Oh, look out.
Okay, here we are.
Or should we just switch to the beamer?
Yeah, I tried switching sockets back.
No, but I mean like the beamer. Can't we just use the beamer and screen it on the wall?
But I never used it, so I don't know.
No, me neither.
We can connect it to the switch over there, but I'm not sure. Ich glaube, hier kann niemand mehr benutzen. So.
Livestream kommt her.
Ja.
Das ist anscheinend schon funktioniert.
New cable.
Yeah? Ah, okay.
Live.
Yeah, let's try. Yeah, let's try.
Thank you, Carlos.
Right there, that's right.
Then I'll take this out
Yeah.
and I'll put this
Thanks, so. Let's see. Okay. So sorry, let's crack on, because obviously there are a lot of people who will speak, so we still need some time. What you see on the left-hand side, the book by Richard Hyman, Strikes, and then on the right-hand side, a newspaper, it's from 2016, and I just wanted to show you, now it's gone again. What I wanted to show you is how different the image of the striker is portrayed in both pictures. So on the left-hand side, I can explain it to you as well. You briefly saw it. You see middle-aged man wearing hard hats, possibly leaving a mine. That's Richard Hyman's book from the early 70s. On the right-hand side, a junior doctor holding up a placard who's possibly female and a person of color. So very, very different ways in which strikers are portrayed, which struck me and which I found interesting. Another issue that is directly reflected in the title is that one of the very first films that were ever shot is La Sortie de l'usine Lumière à Lyon, a short film of workers exiting a factory, and the title is translated into French as Exiting the Factory. Now, Beverly Silver, in her book, Forces of Labor, famously argued where capital goes, labor unrest follows. And that was basically a book about showing how labor struggles shifted to the global south and to new nodes of industry outside the old hubs of industry. But I asked myself, and this is what the title alludes to, what happens when the factory gates shut for good? What happens in those places where processes of deindustrialization take place? And I then found two different pretty general statements on the nature of capitalism in an age of informalization and deindustrialization. Manuel Castells, Spanish sociologist, said capital tends to escape in its hyperspace of pure circulation while labor dissolves its collective entity into an infinite variation of individual existences, which would mean no such thing as a working class. Leo Panitch, on the other hand, argued in the advanced capitalist world, the decline in the size of the traditional industrial labor force is accompanied by the proletarianization of many service and professional occupations and the spread of more unstable casual and contingent employment. And what I try to do in the book is to find out who's right. Is it the case that thanks to deindustrialization, informalization, or the rise of an informational financialized capitalism, the working class or the working classes dissolve, or are there new forms of solidarity, as Panitch suggests? So my research question that I looked at is, what are the class effects of non-industrial strikes, and how far do they contribute to working class formation? My idea was to look at strikes in industry and analyze them from a class angle. That's all I have to say for now on the sort of general design of the book. And I would hand over to Anne, who's presenting the chapter.
Thanks for the introduction. Anne Engelhardt will now make the first comment. Anne is a postdoc at the University of Duisburg-Essen at the Institute for Development and Peace. And she focuses on occupational health and safety and working conditions in the global economy, social movements and transnational trade unions, theories of social reproduction and sustainability, and theories of international political economy. So we will now hear Anne's comment on chapter 6 of the first volume.
Yeah, thank you very much. And first of all, I want to say that I'm really happy that we are all here to celebrate this great success. And everybody who knows Alex knows that he is a more pessimistic person, and also sometimes doesn't like to really believe in that success is possible. But I think the success is really striking, because when we look at what Alex, but also what especially academia has been going through in the past couple of years with the pandemic, with doing social reproductive work, having 2 kids, having to commute back and forth, not knowing what the next contract will bring, if there will be a next contract or anything. And from the backdrop of this, to keep on struggling, to keep on working on such a tremendous books, I find that a big success, and I'm really happy that we can celebrate this today. And I want to also say that I think that Alex, in my opinion, when I read these books and these chapters now, I really love to read them, because I think a lot of the debates and fights we had in the past 10 years are really reflected in there. And I want to say a couple of things on this chapter, but also on the work a bit more broader. The first thing I find really interesting is when I met Alex in 2014, we had a debate on the question of mass strikes and class formation. And Alex, in this time, had just published a work together with Jörg Nowak and Florian Wilde on mass struggles and mass strikes, especially in the global European or in the European periphery during the European crisis. And I remember we had a discussion on the offensive and defensive character of these strikes. And I found that at that time a little bit underdeveloped. Because for me it wasn't, I know I vex you with the word, undialectical. And I had the impression that it was too much static to say, an offensive struggle is when the working class fights for something, a defensive struggle is when the working class fights against something. And I know I simplify it now a little bit, but I can now say, and this is the first thing I want to state about this chapter, that in this chapter on class formation and mass strikes, Alex has developed a much more clearer, complex catalogue of understanding what mass strikes are doing to class formation. I think this is a very important part of this work he did. A second point that I really want to highlight is that the type or the way that Alex is approaching the definition of class and class formation is extremely sensitive towards the agency of the working class. And one thing that he pointed out in the chapter before on defining the class, he says, well, often class is portrayed as something stacked on each other by income. We have the idea of a cake with different layers. He uses this image. And also then the idea of class struggles often quite statically understood. And then Alex and everybody who knows him well knows that he's a very big fan and has a big passion in football, and he's a football coach himself. So he uses this example of associational football team, which is a neat, nice division of struggle teams, like the working class. They have a coach, and the coach is telling them, you have to be trained, and you do this, and this is your tactic, and this is the field. And now the struggle starts, and you fight concessions from the counter team, which is also neatly developed. And what Alex does is to say that the class is not just, like a stacked, like a cake. It's more like an apple crumble. And also, it's not associational football, but it is mob football, which I learned. So we learned in the chapter a lot about different types of football. And in this, the class is, the class struggle, or the class is formed by class struggle. So you can't envision or idealize a class without struggle. It doesn't make sense, it doesn't live without it. And I think this is a point that I find very important, that this mob football actually says you have a hill or hills, you have, especially the team of the ruling class probably on the hill, and you have them armed, and you have people understanding themselves more or less being part of the struggle or not. And what he describes is also the messiness of conceptualizing these kind of processes and to understand that, and I find that very, very important. And the third point I want to raise is that Alex is very, very sensitive against any type of dogmatism when it comes to Marxism. And I find that, especially when he discusses Bukharin, very obvious that any type of a very static understanding of the concepts of class formation, but especially a mechanistic understanding of history, that he is really fighting this off, especially when he discusses the question of, when he uses Rosa Luxemburg, who has a very organic understanding of class formation and conjuncture, to say that, the last stage of history is not socialism or something, it could be barbarism. History is not written, but will be written by class struggle. And I think that's an important thing. And when we think of the mob football, class formation is an uphill struggle for the working class as well. And I find that really important. And in this, idea against dogmatism, he also then develops concepts like class grouping, where the class is basically also spatially placed, class forces, and also class partial and so on. You should have to read it yourself. And there's a point that I want to highlight a lot as well, is that Alex also works with the term class feelings from Rosa Luxemburg. And I remember a colleague, I can't remember his name, but he said, well, Alex is a feminist by practice, but not by writing. And I would say that this definitely changes in this book, not just because he has a chapter on the Spanish mass strikes of women or feminist strikes, but also because he uses the understanding of emotions and feelings in class formation, which is important, and especially male Marxists like to, they discuss economics and how these, rational processes are making the classes and how. But also, when we look at, for instance, the last mass movements that we saw with the Spanish uprisings, the Jeremy Corbyn protests, where people were chanting, when they stand in front, when they're crying because they're happy they achieved something or because they didn't, and so on. This part of belonging to a class, to understand this why I struggle, I think this is a very important aspect, and I think this is something that especially Marxist feminists have been criticizing, that such points have not been part of the analysis of class formation. I think this is something that could be also carved out more. And the only criticism that I found, at least on that chapter, they probably have more, but I don't have the time, is that the point of the perspective of an anti-capitalist perspective is a bit downplayed in the chapter. And I find that Rosa Luxemburg is, especially in her work on the social reform and revolution, she works a lot on this, I say it again, dialectics between the perspective of an anti-capitalist society, how this is developed in struggle itself, how this is not statically there, but how people make the experiences that they can organize their own workplace, that they can organize their own struggles, that they can reproduce themselves, that they can take over. And this is developing the ideas of alternatives to capitalism, or brings them an idea for alternatives to capitalism. And in one of the pictures where we saw you with Eddie Webster, in the background there was the November Revolution. And the November Revolution was exactly the point that people were fighting for an alternative to capitalism. And because of this, they made concessions, and they fought for or got reforms, and not because they were fighting for reforms. And I find that point a bit underdeveloped in this chapter, the question of revolutionary alternatives and how they play a role also in pushing the class formation. And the last point I just want to say is on being part of the working class. Alex Gallas and Rosa Luxemburg have in common that they didn't just write about class formation, but they wanted to be or are a part of it. Rosa Luxemburg herself was in 1905 when she wrote the book on Maastricht, herself a part of the Soviet in Warsaw, and so she really did action research when she wrote this book. She wrote about her own experiences there. She didn't just read articles from newspapers, but she was there, and she was an elected member. And I remember a few years ago when I saw Alex Gallas, who I must say from working class background always saw as a very bourgeois academic, very clear, very precise, and he had this hat, this base cap of his trade union. He had a stall. He was mobilizing for a strike and for indefinite, against the temporary contract problem at the university. And I found that extremely impressive that despite being a state-sanctioned expert, Alex is also part of this class formation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, we have a comment on chapter 1 of the second volume by Anil Shah. Anil is a postdoc at the Working Group for Development and Postcolonial Studies at the University of Kassel. His main research interests are financial markets and development policy, history and theory of critical political economy, and political ecology of social ecological conflicts and transformation. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. I hope this works. If it doesn't, then you won't see the visualization. But nevertheless, I will talk about the methodology. And the methodology is much broader than just the method. So I won't talk about what is the data that he analyzed and how did he do the coding. That's something you can ask him afterwards. But I will talk more about what are the analytical steps that connect a broader abstract theory with the actual steps of getting to an empirical analysis. So that's the way of how methodology is understood here. And it's a specific critique against what Alex calls methodological Fordism. And the alternative that he presents is the case for an incorporated comparison, which is a term or a concept that Philip McMichael has coined. But before I start, I also want to share a personal note. So I started to study global political economy here 10 years ago, also in this room, by the way. And this was also the time when Alex started teaching here. So he was my first lecturer in all the core courses. We had several events together, Introduction to Globalization. We had theories class together. So Alex was also really formative in my intellectual upcoming and shaping here. And then something happened. So we had this first year, a lot of courses together. In the third semester, we could choose different methods. And Alex offered a course on comparative political economy. And I was like, oh, I love Alex, but there's no way that I would go to comparative political economy because comparison is something I will never do. So I'd rather choose the post-structuralist discourse analysis, although I don't consider myself as a post-structuralist because I thought, no. I mean, I really like Alex, but I don't go to a comparative class. Several years later, I understood what kind of comparison he would talk about. And that's also basically what I will talk about today. So the first is why I never wanted to engage with comparisons, and that also links with actually a misunderstanding of how comparisons are understood often in political economy. And this is also how the chapter that Alex writes starts off. So Alex has these three cases that he looks at: Great Britain, Germany, and Spain. And he looks at this junior doctor strike, at the train driver strike here in Germany, and the general feminist strike in Spain. Now, if we have a usual comparison in the social sciences, then we would have some sort of table afterwards where we say, okay, these are all cases, and then we have different categories, X, Y, Z, and we can compare them. So we can have results, okay, what are the characteristics of Great Britain, Germany, and Spain? And then the comparison lies in the similarities and differences, right? So this is something I think rather positive. This is how usually we understand comparisons, and I don't want to say that this kind of comparison doesn't deliver any knowledge. Of course it does. It can also be very helpful and produce insights, and I think Alex would agree. But beyond the similarities and differences, it has also a couple of problems. And the problem that Alex discusses in this chapter are basically two that are combined into what he calls methodological Fordism. So the first problem that is attached to it You can't see the slide, but maybe you can still imagine the table. The first problem is the problem of methodological nationalism. And that's very simple, that basically all of these comparisons, also we can see this in varieties of capitalism, comparative political economy approaches, assume that there are discrete entities. There is a Germany, there is a Spain, there's a Great Britain. So these discrete entities exist, and this is the assumption from which we start a comparison. That's already an assumption which brings a lot of blind spots and problems with it, right? And this is the methodological nationalism that Alex criticizes, particularly coming from a global perspective, right? And what the global perspective is, I will talk about in a bit. Okay, so this is the methodological nationalism. Together with the problem of methodological nationalism comes what he calls a critique of Fordism as a standard variant of capitalist development. Now, this does not only refer to the regulation approach or regulation theory or those people who actually use the term of Fordism to characterize the core capitalist mass consumption, mass production kind of accumulation regime in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, but it refers to all those people, also in the Marxist tradition, that kind of have this idea that there is a standard variety of capitalist development that is based on the exploitation of wage labor in industrial production, and everything else is just something that is an add-on, right? And so this is something that Alex criticizes, and both together is basically the problem of methodological Fordism. Now, as I said, this discrete entities the problem produces the atomism, right? So it doesn't have this global view, and moreover, and that's the point I haven't mentioned so far, it's also very ahistoric. So we start from the present and we say, okay, there is a Spain and there is Germany and there is France or Great Britain or whatever, but we don't get anything about the history, either of the nation states, but also of different scales within the class formation, within, you know, the regulations of the state, etc. And also something you can't see on the slides, but beyond being ahistoric, a point that could be criticized with the methodological Fordism is also extremely Eurocentric. If you look at it from the global perspective, then this idea that there's a standard variant of capitalist development based on industrial production is not the whole account of capitalist development, historically and in the present. It's just not, okay? Good, so this is the reason why I never wanted to engage with comparisons, and also the reason why Alex doesn't want to engage with comparison, but he was a bit cleverer, obviously, than I was, so he found another way. Okay, so what's the Marxist alternative? But this is not the real alternative yet, okay? So this is just the first step. So we can think of the Marxist alternative, easy we would say, okay, no methodological nationalism, we look at capitalism as a global social order, right? And this is also how Marx understands it. We can understand capitalism not as a national product. Capitalism already begins in the long 16th century with the establishment of a world market, okay? So that's the entity we have to take the global level seriously, but then we can have a multi-scalar analysis because we look at macro regions, right? Certain geopolitical blocks, we look at nations, we look at the federal, local level, etc. And all of these levels are, of course, mediated and they're linked to one another, okay? So what Marxist alternatives, whether they are world system theory or other global accounts of capitalism, are usually very strong at, is to provide these multi-scalar analysis, right? They have this global view, but they say, okay, within this global view, we have multiple different layers. But now comes the problem with the Marxist alternative. There is a problem that Bob Jessop, who is the former PhD supervisor of Alex, calls subsumptionism. And the subsumptionism problem, I think, is a very general problem in many Marxist approaches, especially historically, but maybe also still in the present, that Marxist theories are very strong in abstract categories, okay? So we are really good in providing a general account of, you know, what is exploitation, how are capital dynamics working, etc. So we, on this general level of abstraction, we have a lot of concepts and ideas, etc. But what does this mean for empirical research? And the problem of subsumptionism basically means that we press our theoretical concepts, our sophisticated understanding of what global capitalism is, onto the empirical world, onto the data. And actually, the empirical analysis itself is not so important. So we are doing the interviews, maybe we'll look at some statistics, maybe we'll look at document analysis, but we're actually just looking for the findings that we want to find that support our clever theories, right? That's a bit stylized, but this is basically the problem of subsumptionism, that there's no emphasis on the in the logics of the empirical material itself, right? We don't listen to the material if the material tells us something different, right? If it doesn't fit into our theoretical categories, if it challenges the account, right? And this is the problem that we can see, particularly with the approaches like world system theory. Okay, the problem of this approach then is we have this stratified account, but how is the variegation operationalized? Okay, so how can we understand all of these, the mediation of all of these different levels? That's an actual problem. And also, how can we, in this account, also account for the ambiguities and contradictions? Because if we just have our clear theories of what capitalism is and how class domination works and how class formation works, then we are not attentive to the actual real world processes, which are usually more complex, right? More ambiguous. People don't have a necessarily clear class position in the reality, right? Maybe in the abstract theory we have class position, but in the reality things are much, much more complex, right? And that's, I think, what you discuss with the junior doctors, for example, right? So if we're not looking at blue-collar workers, but we're looking at rather privileged workers, they're part of the working class, but at the same time they exercise quite an autonomy and even a position where they are kind of oppressing or directing other parts of the working class. So we have to account for this hierarchization, for the fragmentation within the workforce and the complexity of class positions and of course also class consciousness. Okay, so what's the alternative? The case for the incorporated comparisons. Now, basically what Alex does, and I really, really like this because I think many Marxists have not really worked well with different levels of abstraction, and I think Alex has a very clear understanding of what levels of abstraction we're talking. So basically, he introduces three different levels of abstraction. The first one is the capitalist mode of production, right? The general idea of how capital works, as described by Marx and many other Marxists afterwards. Now, the specific social formation is a more concrete thing that comes, I think, from the tradition of Althusser and Poulan-Sas, where we look at a specific configuration of the capital-labor-state relationship. So, for example, neoliberal capitalism would be a specific social formation in a specific geography, specific time frame, where we can see more concrete institutions of how the general logics of capital, labor, and state are implemented. Okay, so each level becomes more concrete, and the more concrete it becomes, of course, we add complexity. Okay, and the most complex then would be the conjuncture. And a conjuncture, again, is something that comes from Louis Althusser, Nico Poulan-Sas, Stuart Hall, that kind of traditional conjunctural Marxism, as Alex would call this. And the current conjuncture is that within neoliberal capitalism, we are witnessing what he would call the catastrophic disequilibrium. So like an organic crisis of this social formation, but possibly also of the broader capitalist mode of production that started with the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and then continued with the Euro crisis and all of these crises that we've seen recently, all of these strikes. So basically, in the 2010s, we can see an entire conjuncture of crisis, new forms of resistance, social movements, etc. And within this conjuncture, he places his three cases, okay? And what is the beauty of this is that there's a link of all of these three levels of abstraction, right, through the cases, but this is not a one-way road. It's not only from the global to the local one, but it also goes way back up again. So the basic idea is to also get some insights from these specific strikes and cases for the general idea. Okay, no time for this. The only problem, and I think this is also important to know, that Alex acknowledges there is also a problem with this qualitative approach of incorporated comparison, namely that generalizations from very few qualitative cases remains a challenge, right? We don't have big N data. We have to be very careful about the generalizations we make from specific cases. Okay, last slide. I have 1 minute, half a minute? Not really, okay. I'm over the time? Okay, very briefly, 3 questions and points. The first one is, how does the self-forming whole that Philip McMichael describes emerge from your research? So I would be interested in this arrow upwards. How do the 3 cases help us to understand the current conjuncture? Because I think what you do really nicely is to place cases within it, but then what's the road upwards? So how can we see, how does the strike and the strike research help us to understand the current social formation? And also what is relational about it? The second point is the relevance of history. I mean, obviously you argue for a historical materialist perspective, but you've chosen to do only the spatial part of the incorporated comparison and not the historical one. And Philip McMichael basically says there are 2 forms, and you've chosen only one, and of course it has reasons. I would be curious to hear more about that. And the final one, and maybe that's the most interesting for our debate, is the question of, do you fall in the trap of methodological post-Fordism? Because I read your account a bit like, okay, there's deindustrialization, and when you say, for example, okay, we have Beverly Silver tells us where capital moves, labor unrest moves. Yes, but if we take industrial and deindustrialization as the standard case, are we eclipsing that most of the labor struggles, most of the class struggles that are happening have historically never been in the industries, right? There are agrarian struggles, there are peasant struggles, there are struggles in the informal economy. So taking this perspective maybe more globally and also from the South, how can we challenge this new methodological post-Fordism? Thank you.
Thanks, Anil. So thirdly, we have Dr. Oliver Pye commenting on Alex's book. Oliver is currently interim professor of the Working Group for International and Intersocietal Relations at the University of Kassel. He also works at the University of Bonn, and his research interests lie in North-South relations and development theories, political ecology and socio-ecological transformation, and labor geography and labor movements. Oliver, the stage is yours to comment on Chapter 4 of Volume 2.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad I don't have a presentation. Right, so the chapter that I'll be talking about is called Outside the Factory Gates, Strikes in Non-Industrial Workplaces Around the World. And of course I'm quite interested in that because I'm looking mainly at the Southeast Asian region. And so this is a chapter based on Alex looking at reports from a whole range of newspapers that cover quite a lot of the world, not all of it. I'll come back to that at the end, but in the period 2000 to 2019, is that correct?
2007-8 to 2020 or something, 21. Yeah.
Okay. So I've got that wrong already. And so he's basically looking at strikes that happen in all these different countries and trying to understand what's going on in the non-industrial workplace, right? But how does he do it? I mean, so he's not just counting the strikes. He's trying to analyze what that means then for class formation. So where is he coming from? We've heard a little bit already, but I just like to stress that he's an anti-deterministic historical materialist from a global labor studies kind of approach, and as we've heard, on the side of workers, so taking that position explicitly, and so it's just that I like. And he's interested in class formation, so he has a sort of quite interesting class analysis we've heard a little bit about, which is not automatically just arising from the position in the relations of production, but he says the relations of production only exist if there is a state. So it's not just an economic relation, it's also a political and ideological formation, right? And so he's interested in how, so his point is that class doesn't just arise from the positionality in the production process, but actually comes from the struggle against tendencies which prevent class formation, which he is drawing on Balanzas here, the atomization of the competition between individual workers and the nation as kind of ideological formation of capitalism. So these prevent class formation, and so he starts from the premise that class formation happens through the struggle. He writes the struggle comes first. So that's how he's approaching this whole question, and he's interested in how working class formation develops that can challenge capitalist class formation. Yeah, so it's not just interested in strikes per se, but whether this actually then developed into a more generalized political consciousness of a whole class. So he then takes his data and starts analyzing it, and he has 4 different types of strikes that he looks at. First are what he calls bread and butter strikes, which basically, and he writes, collective bargaining strikes happen all the time and across the globe. So this is sort of a very normal feature of these non-industrial workplaces. And he has interesting examples here, for example, the Zimbabwean cricketers who went on strike and that kind of thing. But he's basically saying, okay, this already contradicts Castell's position that non-industrial capitalism means that there's just basically a heap of individual existences. Yeah? So if this is happening all over the place, then obviously there's something going on in terms of class formation. But he says this kind of struggle is actually tends to just reproduce class relations instead of challenging them, because they're restricted to a very economic sort of relation which is defined by capitalist class formations. The second type of strikes that he looks at are the extension strikes, and he's talking about extension strikes that where usually individualized labor relations become subject to regulation, reorganization, or collective negotiation, and has lots of examples here. For example, call center workers in Germany, a 6-week strike in Norway by delivery riders who won a collective bargaining agreement, the Uber drivers in Geneva who went on strike. Then he talks about Amazon, with also examples of transnational coordination of strikes happening in this global corporation. And other really interesting stuff, the hashtag outsourcing must fall movement in South Africa, where the student protests against tuition fees were then connected to struggles by workers who were being outsourced, so working in cleaning, catering, and gardening, and they were struggling against being outsourced. So all those workers who have already been outsourced here in German universities. So this, I think, is already, I think he would say this is already sort of a next step in terms of class formation. And also contradicting Castells, because of course a lot of it is the sort of gig economy, digitalized capitalism type areas where workers were not necessarily to organize. Yeah. The third level is expansive politicized strikes, where the economic demands are also connected to political demands, and this is especially in the public sector, because of course a lot of strikes in the public sector are automatically political, because it's about political decisions, where funding goes, etc., etc. And he has the example of the Charité strikes, which were, been going on for several years. What else? Walmart in China, metro drivers in Georgia, teachers in the US, and so all these strikes have become in various ways very politicized because it's about political decisions on the state level. And the fourth and most expansive level that he looks at are the class-based strikes, where they become sort of generalized cross-sector strikes against political economic offenses by the ruling class, either defensive or offensive strikes. And here I'll just read class-based and organic strikes in Argentina, Belgium, Brazil, Botswana, Chad, Chile, Costa Rica, Finland, France, French Polynesia, Greece, India, Italy, Morocco, Portugal, Puerto Rico, Spain, Switzerland, Tunisia, and Turkey. Yeah? So you get a sort of idea of actually, the expanse of these massive strikes. And he also talks about the general strike in India, the biggest general strike ever in the history of the labor movement, 250 million workers. So that's a bit contested, that number. Or an 8-week public sector strike in Botswana, which led to a rebellion against the authoritarian government. And I don't know how many of you heard about that strike. Yeah? So I have to finish. So 2 points maybe. One is coverage. So I'm a bit skeptical whether the newspaper approach really can, if you can really get a whole overview of the strikes. So my impression would be that there's many more strikes happening that we don't know about or that we do not discuss, just in terms of the coverage. And Southeast Asia, you don't look at all. And for example, these gig worker strikes, except that's been happening a lot there, with 47 wildcat strikes by gig workers in Indonesia, platform worker strikes in Hong Kong, South Korea, and Thailand. Or, for example, the mass strike and civil disobedience movement against the military coup in Myanmar. So I think there's even much more going on. Yeah? So maybe that's one question. The other one is, I guess, the political question. So it's a very hopeful chapter because, of course, basically the upshot is that, yes, there is a global process of class formation happening in non-industrial sectors. Yeah? So this, of course, rejects a very Eurocentric sort of idea of this argument that the working class is finished and it's basically no longer a force to change, because if we take a global labor studies process, it's not just the non-industrial, but also, of course, the industrial proletariat is massively enlarged. And if you compare that to when Rosa Luxemburg was talking about mass strike, then, of course, the material condition of having a global internationalist labor movement is now massively enhanced in terms of the material basis of the proletariat. I mean, the proletariat is massively expanded in comparison to the early 20th century. But that's where the political question then comes in, because, of course, we can celebrate this, and it's a hopeful message. But Rosa Luxemburg was arguing from a position where she had a communist party which was intervening and leading and generalizing. And, of course, that's something that we don't really have. We don't have, even though we have this huge basis for a global proletarian sort of class formation, we don't have a new international. The first international and third international, were really important, and now we don't have that. So what's your political conclusion then in terms of strategy?
Your chance to respond.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much. I'm really honored and I'm really happy to hear these sort of deep engagements with my work. And you raised ever so many important and great questions. And also thanks for sharing some of the personal anecdotes. It was nice to remember some of those moments. I want to start with something both Oliver and Anne highlighted, which is the pessimism or the optimism of the will, the pessimism of the intellect question. And I think you characterized me correctly. I think of myself as being a pessimist and being more on the pessimism of the intellect side. And yet, and I think your characterization, Oliver, of my book is correct. I think I have written an optimistic book. And I find that really interesting myself. I don't know whether we can still switch it on, or at least try. Because that again links me with Eddie and the book of his, Grounding Globalization, where Eddie and his colleagues made an argument that in this moment of neoliberal globalization, we are seeing the first traces of a global counter-movement against neoliberal capitalism. And I always found that this a pretty optimistic claim, and they were criticized for being overly optimistic. And I want to share you my own verdict in my book, and then I think, yes, in a certain way, my verdict is also optimistic, so I'll read it out. My case studies reveal tensions among organized workers and unions in Germany and Spain, and also the sober fact that neither the British nor the Spanish strikes managed to derail the austerity agendas of their respective governments. But what Castells did not see at the time was the rise of trade unions and labor activism in the service sector and their continued relevance in the public sector, as well as the ample evidence that working class formation is indeed taking place in those sectors. In light of the evidence I found for class formation, I contend that Castells' claim is difficult to defend as a general observation, and that Panitch, all in all, is right. So in a certain way, yes, that would be the optimism and the grounds for optimism. These struggles take place, and these struggles mean something. But Oliver, you're right to highlight the political point, and Anna, I think you raised it as well with revolution and the question of, how do you produce this rupture? And what I tend to think is something that we can learn from Luxemburg and the more conjunctural thinking. And this is how I would go about this issue. Is if there's one thing we can learn from this conjunctural thinking is that things can change very quickly. Last week, we maybe thought we were on the brink of fascism in France. Today, I don't know. The problems haven't gone away, but this looks different. So what we learn from this view of history is that these changes happen very quickly. And I think that's something Luxemburg really wants to highlight. That, no, we don't have any guarantees that, we're on the right side of history and that we will win in the end. But conjunctures offer possibilities, and conjunctures change quickly. So that is also, I guess, something we can cling on to. But that doesn't resolve the more political point about that you raised, or both of you raised actually, about what is the role of organization, what is the role of parties in all of that. I tend to think that, of course, these turns happen, but of course, in those turns, it is important to have the resources that organizations afford. And you can link that to trade unions for all their problems, which are very, very briefly spelled out at the beginning. I'm still an active trade unionist simply because unions are pools of knowledge, pools of resources, can organize strikes very quickly, so they're important. And I would say, in a similar manner, I think we can criticize parties on all sorts of grounds, the ways in which they co-opt political projects that fight for change, the ways in which they pursue policies that impose social domination and reproduce social domination, but still, I would say they offer these resources that are really important. What we can see in Luxembourg is that at the end of the day, both things matter. So spontaneous uprisings matter, and then it also matters that there are organizations that do something with them. Where in the present moment these organizations come from, that's a difficult question. And I don't have a simple answer or a silver bullet that I could offer. This is how we build our unions and parties and so forth. I guess, Anna, you mentioned the activism on campus. The lesson from that is always you need to reach out and talk to people and communicate and try to organize these, or try to organize people through communication and direct interaction, I guess. Okay, so I've now talked at length about the political question, about the question of revolution. I also want to come to some of Anil's points because I think they are incredibly interesting. And the question whether I fall into the trap of methodological postmodernity, I really like that formulation. One thing I should clarify is that I fundamentally disagree with someone like Guy Standing. I don't know whether you're familiar with his work. He essentially says, yeah, you know, it's wrong to say there's no working class. What we today have is a precariat. And the precariat replaces what used to be the industrial working class. My point is emphatically not to say that the working class today is in the public and service sectors and that the industrial work doesn't matter. My point is taking up this idea that we have entered an age where there have been processes of deindustrialization, and from that we derive that we have entered this new financialized informational capitalism, and because of that we don't have a working class anymore. And I would say, yes, working class formation happens in strikes in the industrial and non-industrial sectors, and they are, of course, also linked. So that's an important point. So in that sense, that would be one part of my response to you. The other part raises something where I really struggled when I did my research, and that was, how do you deal with this mass of information that you're dealing with if you look at capitalism from a global angle? And in a certain way, I narrowed it. So I have this overview chapter that Oliver talked about, and then I have these case studies, which again are about Western Europe. And obviously you can say this is still a somewhat limited sample. And I think, Oliver, you said that as well. And I think you're right. The problem that I noticed in my own research process in writing 2 volumes is that it would take even more work, and that then leads me, I think, to conclude that that can only be a collective effort, and that we can only do this collectively, and that would mean, obviously, exchanging ideas on what happens in Southeast Asia, whereas I really struggled, partly also because of simple language barriers. So I sought out the newspapers that I looked at, also on not just on the basis of them being located in key countries for the global political economy, like South Africa, like India, like Argentina, the US, and then the 3 Western European countries, but also basically on the grounds of, languages that I can read. And, then I think we can only shoulder this challenge together in a way. About the question of history, well, there is a bit of a historical chapter as well that we now didn't talk about, which sort of traces the development of neoliberalism and neoliberalization. So that starts in the 1970s. That's not a long way back, but still tries to somewhat address the issue that obviously a lot of the things that are unfolding in this specific conjuncture link back to things that have happened in the decades before. I think if you want to understand the present moment, you need a sort of spatial approach. But I would also say at the end of the day, yes, any present moment is also the product of history, and so there is no way around dealing with these continuities and discontinuities. I guess we also need a historical perspective. I think I need to finish now.
Yes.
But you can ask questions.
Yeah, so I'm sure there's many thoughts and or questions in the audience, and we have about a little less than 20 minutes left for a discussion or questions and answers. And I would like to take four.
I should pass around the book so you can have a look.
4 questions and comments and see whether we have time for further ones afterwards. And for those online, Matja, you will check the chat, right? If
Yes, no questions so far.
No questions. Okay, thank you. Are there questions, comments? Yeah, we have a first one, Lisa.
I'm a bit reluctant to go first because my brain is still a bit messy, but first of all, I think you convinced me when saying that this was an optimistic book. And I'm really going to read it because I think we all need optimistic books. And that's because I myself come from a very pessimistic branch of global labor studies on migration and precarization. And that's why I have some questions to you towards. There are questions that are puzzling myself and I don't have any answers, but maybe you have something in your case studies. First question is the question why do people have to work and where do they come from and how does this matter for their experiences of work and also for the class formation and the struggles and what the role of the state therein, because we talk about your case studies are countries with the workfare states, migration regime that produce hierarchizations and fragmentations that are not so easy to overcome with a good trade union strategy and a good organizing strategy, but that are very, very real because people don't perceive their interests as being the same. And that's not only a perception, but the intermediate experiences might also differ. So did that come up in your case studies? What do you do with it? And the second question is, does it matter what people do at work? Mm-hmm. And in what sense and how they experience it? And there maybe also comes in the question, is strike really different in non-industrial workplaces? Or do we still have the same idea about an organization process that goes the same way? Is there a difference between bullshit jobs and essential jobs, for example, or things like that? So I guess these are my questions, and the last one is the most difficult and rather relates to the first, the different experiences of precarity, because I remember when the concept came up, we discussed a lot, are we all part of the same? We as academic precarious workers in our experiences and people that come from very limiting and very restrictive opportunities, and how do we deal with these different experiences of precarity? I assume that you have asked this yourself as an academic worker.
We have a second, Janina and Carlos afterwards.
Yes, thank you, Alex, and thank you for the comments, which were really interesting to me. I think I'm really excited to read the book now. But there are some questions still, maybe you can just kind of clarify for me, because I'm still a little bit puzzled about your class definition. And Ollie gave a little bit of the overview of what you were defining as class, but I'm still kind of like trying to put the pieces together, because when we were talking about the struggles being connected into a larger framework, I'm wondering, like, in what way are these struggles you were investigating actually are connected in terms of their practices and their formation? Because that's kind of like how I perceive your class definition, and I didn't really understand how you did that now, because that's actually the very interesting point when we look at the global formation of classes and how they politically have kind of like a political output that is maybe going beyond the France example, which is kind of like a little bit lacking, I think. And then I'm wondering also concerning your understanding of class, who's the main opponent in your understanding? Because as I understood it, you were trying to move beyond the nation state, and still kind of the nation state is still kind of very important, especially when we talk about service workers in different areas such as care, where the conflict is less about between the bosses and the employers, but actually between the state, and it's kind of like very hard to navigate them. And then one last question. We usually, when we talk about class relations, we talk about fragmentations of the working class. And there is an approach to, or a political approach, how you cope with these fragmentations that kind of poses the question if we need a strategy that is kind of flexible in the way class formation is actually happening in the outlook of political projects, because there are not so many things that kind of what are shared experiences, kind of you're addressing your question, but there are lots of things that fragment the working class. So how do you would you respond to an idea of flexible combinations of alliances between different fragments or fractions of the working class?
Thank you. We now have 6 questions already. Maybe before you start, Carlos, is there something in the chat?
No.
Okay, then I would say Carlos, and we close this first round because I think you have enough questions on your plate.
I just have one. Thanks, first of all, for sharing with us your books. When I heard during the presentations about this idea of a global counter-movement against neoliberal capitalism, I also heard that you took newspaper articles until 2020, and I was wondering, I had the shortcoming that I have not read your books, if you analyze the conjuncture of the COVID-19 pandemic. Because if there has been a moment in my perspective and in the short life of a human being compared with the time of capitalism, if there has been a point in which the shortcomings of this mode of production has been shown, was during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I thought, with hope as well, that there was a global counter-movement showing what was going on. But 4 years after, 5 years after, I don't see it. So if you include in your books, what was your analysis about that? Because until now, there's still puzzling to me.
We have about 10 minutes.
Okay, so I will try to be short, as short as I can be. An important point about my work is that I presume workers are fragmented through the state. That's crucial. And a crucial part of that are the migration regimes. And what I saw in my case studies was that this issue wasn't necessarily at the forefront, but it's still figured somehow, especially in the case of the general and feminist strikes in Spain. That was an instance where this was also part of the discussion, especially in the feminist strikes, I would say, that, you know, these experiences of precarity, as you put it, differ, and that you need to address these differences. And I found this idea of the general strike interesting because one argument that was put forward constantly for choosing this type of strike, which was, you know, one day and we all go out and go on strike together, was to say people who are in very precarious positions can actually take part in something like that, and it's easier than your typical, what I call bread and butter collective bargaining strike. You join a demonstration and maybe don't turn up for work, either you call in sick or you don't turn up and claim that you are also protected because, in the Spanish understanding, there is a right to strike in general strikes. Which links to the question you posed about my own position. I tried to clarify that with the use of the term contradictory class locations that I found in Eric Olin Wright's work and that I find important. So I would not claim that I'm in a working class location simply because of the degree of autonomy that I enjoy over my work, which is completely different from what people in consistent class locations on the side of workers experience. And still, I would say there is possibility for alliances, or what I call adsorption, so of people in contradictory class locations supporting strike efforts. And in my own experience, if I talk to people who are workers who go on strike, and I tell them I'm a trade unionist myself and I've been on strike, that is already that's already a ground that can open a conversation. So I think these experiences create links. On the question of connections, well, the main opponent is easy. The main opponent is capital. What that means in detail is obviously complicated. That to me is clear. It's mediated through the state, but the main opponent is capital. The connections are found were complicated, and that's maybe also why we haven't discussed them in great detail yet. To give you the example, I talk about this junior doctor strike, again, a contradictory class location. And why was there a connection to workers? Well, or to other workers? Well, because it turned into a strike over the National Health Service in Britain, which is crucially important for the reproduction of labor power and for the reproduction of life in Britain in general. And also because these junior doctors saw themselves as people defending this free and public healthcare system. So that would be an example of how such connections that I detected come about. Carlos, about COVID. Yeah, it's great that you mention it, because when I wrote the chapter, it was in the midst of the pandemic. And my method actually reflects that. I also chose this newspaper type of research because I was sat in my flat and I thought, I can't go out and travel and talk to people and so forth, but I can read newspapers. So I sort of got the first stage of it, at least. What did it change? Well, there were openings, but what was also very clear was that, and that was particularly clear with the Spanish case, that this strike movement had an amazing momentum, and then the pandemic hit, and that made it really difficult to carry on. So the global counter movement, well, that's, I guess, Eddie's very optimistic kind of idea from the 2000s. I wouldn't very much see it as a global counter movement, but more as an ensemble and a multiplicity of struggles that take place and that create potentials. That's how I would see it.
We have 5 more minutes. Is there maybe one question, comment?
We started a bit late, so maybe we can run 5 minutes over time.
Well, it's already 22. I mean,
I don't know. It depends on you.
Are there questions, comments still? Is there a comment question online? No? Do you want to take 3 more minutes or something to say anything you want concerning the book or the discussions?
Yeah, there's this thing that you have seen. I know that it is prohibitively expensive. I very much hope that the book will appear on certain websites and so forth. But if you want to buy it, there is a discount code here. It makes it a little bit cheaper. It's still quite expensive, but yeah. So you can order it online, and there is a code that you can use. What else is there to say? Maybe I pick up some of the questions I didn't respond to. So how does it matter what people do, for example? It matters. It matters, for example, blatantly obvious example, I talked a lot about the public sector. If you go on strike in the public sector, you save your employer money. Usually. I mean, there are different configurations of that, but usually the problem with public sector strikes is you can't do something that is really important for strikes in the private sector, which is you hit the profits of your employer. And that makes a difference in terms of how they play out. And that also then means you have to have a strategy of dealing with this, either through creating disruption or through creating new alliances. And something that I always find super inspiring and interesting is what Oliver briefly mentioned, the strikes at Charité. So the university hospital system in Berlin, where the main demand was not higher wages, but the main demand was more people working as nurses and in care. So the demand to the employer was simply employ more people and create different patient-staff ratios. That meant that in a certain way, yes, you didn't hit the employer with, creating economic problems for them, but you hit them with something else. You hit them with saying, listen, we can't do our job properly and we need to go on strike for doing it properly. So in that sense, that automatically created a different dynamic. And I think these dynamics are quite visible when you look at the different cases. At the same time, and that's also something that is important to me, there are basic features of the strikes that I looked at that are very similar to industrial strikes. Notions of solidarity, notions of coming together, learning processes, notions of we are on one side and they are on the other side, and we need to attack them and we need to act together in order to advance our demands. So in many ways, there are also similarities. And obviously, I've also found, especially in the case of the general strikes, but also in some other cases, instances of solidarity that cross this boundary between non-industrial and industrial strikes. And so that's also something that is very important to bear in mind. A lot of this sort of labor research creates very detailed accounts of what is specific about a certain sector, a certain labor process and so forth. But, there are also communalities that then are the basis for solidarity.
Thank you. Talking about strikes, there's a short announcement.
It's not a strike, but labor struggles. I mean, Alex and many who are here are involved in ongoing strikes against precarity here at the university. And we have seen an unprecedented budget cuts that are happening at the moment, like huge austerity wave. Probably it will intensify in the next month and years because the German state is investing billions into military, and they will cut a lot of education and social funding. So next week, Tuesday, 16th of July at 5 o'clock, there will be a meeting on campus. It's a strategic meeting from the group Uni Kassel Unbefristet. And everyone is invited, no matter whether you work or like what position you work here. It's in Mönckebergstraße 7 in the room 0608. And that's like a strategic meeting where we engage in some of these questions. And next week, Thursday, on the 18th of July, there will be a demonstration in front of campus organized by the two unions on campus, Verdi and GEW, together with our initiative Uni Kassel Unbefristet and with the AStA, the student representatives. It takes place at 12 o'clock, so in the lunch break. And it would be amazing if many people show up and if we are very loud, because at the moment, these budget cuts are really risking to increase the precarity here dramatically for everyone, for the student assistants, of course, for external lecturers, for everyone. So, yeah, get organized and become part of this optimistic group that tackle austerity and precarity.
Thank you. I would say we can close this book launch event now. Thank you, Matja, for organizing the live stream, and thank you everyone for being here with us today, and of course thank you for presenting and commenting. Yeah, I wish you a good rest of the evening.
And thank you, Hannah, for chairing.
Yeah.